Hello, in this video I'm going to be talking about ethnic literatures, more specific those in the United States. I'm going to be talking about Native American, African American, and Asian American literature. So let's get started. First, we have Native American literature. This means all those works that were and are produced by Native Americans in what is now the United States. This goes from the pre-Columbian times through the present. Some of the characteristics, themes, and topics that were usually talked in these works were oral traditions, the belief in the coexistence of physical and spiritual realities, the necessity for humans to maintain a harmonious connection with all parts of the world, and the world as a sacred place. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about some works and authors through history. First, we have before European contact, everything was oral, so we have chants, poetry, songs, and narrative storytelling, which was used in some rituals and ceremonies. Then we have the early writers, which wrote mostly autobiographies and political topics. Some authors here we have Samson Occom, Sarah Winnemucca, and John Merlin Rich, who wrote the first Native American novel ever. In the 1900s, we have more autobiographies. We have traditional stories, as many white American audiences became really interested in the culture. We also have the first works of fiction, some essays, and plays. Here we have three authors, Darcy McNichol, John Joseph Matthews, and John Milton Oskison. But the two main authors of this period were Lynn Riggs, a playwright. He wrote Green Grow the Lilacs, which later became the base for the popular Broadway musical Oklahoma. And we also have N. Scott Nomaday, who was the first Pulitzer Prize winner, Native American winner, and he won that prize for his novel House Made of Dawn. And last but not least, in the 21st century, we have Louise Erdrich and Tommy Orange, who both came finalists for the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. And we also have Joy Harjo, who became the first Native American to hold the post of United States Poet Laureate. Now let's talk about African American literature. This means all those works produced in the United States by writers of African descent. This dates back to the late 18th century to the present. Some of the characteristics, topics, and themes that can be usually found in these works are the role of African Americans within the larger American society, African American culture, freedom and equality, slavery and racism, and some oral forms such as sermons, gospel music, blues, and rap. Now we have some important authors through history. In the early African American literature, we have Lucy Terry, whose poem Bar's Fight is considered the oldest known piece of African American literature. Then we have Phyllis Wheatley, who wrote a book called Poems on Various Subjects. She was highly praised for this book by George Washington, but many white people found it hard to believe that a black woman could be intelligent enough to write poetry, so she had to go to court and defend herself to prove that she actually wrote her book, and she won. Then we have Jupiter Hammond, who is considered to be the first published black writer in America. And last but not least, we have Harriet Wilson, whose novel Our Nig is considered the first African American novel published in the US. The slave narratives was a subgenre of African American literature which began in the middle of the 19th century to represent the African American perspective of slavery, and a lot of former slaves wrote slave narratives telling about their lives and experiences. Here we have Harriet Jacobs and Frederick Douglass, who eventually became the most prominent African American of his time and one of the most influential authors in American history. Then we have the post-slavery era, with a lot of nonfiction works about the conditions of African Americans in the country. Some authors here are W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, and Paul Laurence Dunbar, who became the first African American poet to gain national prominence with his book Oak and Ivy. Then we have the Civil Rights Movement era. Some authors here are James Baldwin, Ralph Ellison, Gwendolyn Brooks, who became the first African American to win the Pulitzer Prize for her book Annie Allen, and we also have Martin Luther King Jr. Later on, in the middle of the 20th century, we have Toni Morrison, who became the first African American woman to win the Nobel Prize in Literature, and whose novel Beloved won the Pulitzer Prize. We also have Alice Walker, who won both the Pulitzer Prize and the American Book Award for her novel The Color Purple, which was later made into a film and later turned into a Broadway musical. And finally, we have Alex Haley, who won the Pulitzer Prize for his book Roots, the Saga of an American Family. Last, we have the Asian American literature, which includes those works produced in the United States by writers of Asian descent. This goes back to the end of the 19th century to the present. Some common themes and topics and characteristics in Asian American literature include race and culture, Western racism towards Asians, the effects of traditional Asian culture on Asian Americans living in a more liberal country, sense of identity, and the immigrant experience. Then we have some important authors and works through history. In the early Asian American literature, we have Yan Fo Li and his autobiography When I Was a Boy in China. We also have Sui Sin Far and Young Hil Kang, whose novel East Goes West is considered to be an early Asian American classic. Then we have World War II and the 1950s. This period brought decisive changes for the Asian American community so that the writers often reflected it in their works. Some authors here are Chin Yang Lee and his novel Flower Drum Song, which later became a Broadway musical. We also have Eat a Bowl of Tea, which is considered to be another Asian American classic. We also have Toshio Mori and Monica Sone, whose novel Nise Daughter tells the experience of many young Japanese American women in the Japanese camps. Last, the 1970s and recent years. First, we have Aie, an anthology of Asian American writers, which was written by Frank Chin, Jeffrey Paul Chan, Lawson Fusao Inaba, and Sean Su Wong. Then we have Maxine Hong Kingston, whose novel The Woman Warrior won the National Book Critics Circle Award. We also have Shirley Gyeoklin Lim, whose memoir Among the White Moon Faces won the American Book Award. And finally, we have Jhumpa Lahiri, whose collection of short stories, Interpreter of Maladies, won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. And that's it. Thanks.